The story of Ojwang is not simply about the death of a blogger. It is a moral parable for a continent long haunted by fear, silence, and institutional decay. Ojwang's story teaches us that the most dangerous man in an unjust society is not the one with weapons, but the one who dares to speak the truth. He had no title, no fortune, no political influence. All he had were words, and in the right moment, those words became more powerful than any law budget or presidential decree. His death crystallizes a painful truth in societies where truth-telling is criminalized. Silence becomes a weapon used by the state against its own people. From this tragedy, we learn that silence is not neutral, it is a choice that empowers the oppressor and abandons the oppressed. When governments use policies instead of bullets to crush dissent, the pain is less visible, but just as real. Ruto's budget raised taxes on life's most basic needs, while allocating nothing toward accountability or justice. Ojwang's murder was not an isolated act of violence. It was the culmination of a system designed to punish awareness and reward obedience. Every time a journalist is silenced, every time a student is beaten for carrying a banner, the message is clear: truth is the enemy. But this time something broke that silence. And it did not come from the usual sources of global outrage. It came from a soldier thousands of kilometers away, dressed not in a suit, but in a military uniform. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's voice reached Kenya, not with diplomatic phrasing, but with clarity, courage, and emotional truth. His words were not just political statements, they were a moral intervention. He reminded the continent that Africa's struggle is one that no injustice is truly local, when the structures that enable it are global and systemic. Traoré's response teaches us about leadership rooted in conscience, not calculation. He spoke not because it was convenient, but because it was necessary. That is what makes leadership transformative. It is the willingness to carry burdens that are not your own, because justice knows no borders. Traoré did not benefit politically from speaking out. In fact, his boldness risked diplomatic tensions. But true leadership does not ask, "What will I gain?" It asks, "What is the cost of my silence?" By answering Ojwang's death with defiant compassion, Traoré lit a signal fire for every silenced voice on the continent. Another key lesson is that change does not begin with institutions, it begins with people. The reaction of students, journalists, mothers, orphans, and artists showed that when pain is shared, it becomes a collective force. When a blogger's video becomes a national anthem of grief, when teenagers recite his words like scripture, it proves that conscience cannot be killed. A bullet ended Ojwang's life, but it could not end the questions he asked. His words became a mirror in which Africa saw its contradictions, its fears, and its forgotten courage. Ojwang's story also calls us to examine how information is controlled, manipulated, and suppressed. The Kenyan government's attempt to ban the Traoré video is not just censorship, it is an admission of fear. Power that is secure does not fear questions. Power that is legitimate does not fear transparency. When governments criminalize dissent, they reveal their moral bankruptcy. The lesson here is clear: when a people begin to question, when they begin to speak, no regime can stop the tide without drowning in its own lies. This story teaches us that symbols matter. Ojwang became a symbol not because he wanted to, but because he refused to disappear. His final video, only 27 seconds long, became a sacred text to those who had lost hope. It is proof that in the digital age, one voice can ignite millions. But it also reminds us that symbols are fragile. If we forget Ojwang, if we let his story be swallowed by the next headline, then the system wins. We must protect memory the way others protect power, with vigilance, with purpose, and with unity. There is a broader lesson about continental solidarity. Africa is often described as fragmented, divided by language, ethnicity, and colonial borders. But this story defied that narrative. From Senegal to Uganda, from Ghana to Ethiopia, voices rose in unison, not because of shared ethnicity or faith, but because of shared injustice. That unity born of outrage and grief is the foundation of any real Pan-African movement. The lesson is this: if we can be united in mourning, we can also be united in action. Traoré's role also compels us to rethink the meaning of African leadership. He is not part of the traditional elite. He is young, military-trained, often portrayed as an outsider. And yet he was the first to respond with humanity. His example forces us to ask, what kind of leaders does Africa need? Those who guard their political careers with silence, or those who risk everything to say what millions feel but fear to voice? His stance is a model not of perfection, but of responsibility. He did not stay silent when silence was the safest option. Finally, this story teaches us that revolutions are not always loud. They begin with questions. They begin with someone asking why too many times to be ignored. The revolution in Kenya did not begin with a riot. It began with a blog post, with a flyer, with a quiet whisper in a university dorm. And as long as those questions keep being asked, as long as people like Traoré keep answering, change is inevitable. Because in the end, power may control the headlines, but truth controls the future. The lesson then is both simple and sobering. Freedom is not a gift. It is not something given from above, but demanded from below. Ojwang's death was a loss, but it was also a warning, a wake-up call, a litmus test for whether Africans will continue to suffer in silence or begin to build a new vocabulary of defiance, justice, and unity. If we want to honor him, we must not romanticize his sacrifice. We must institutionalize it, turn his courage into curriculum, turn his final words into policy debates, turn his name into a verb. Because the true tragedy is not that Ojwang died. The true tragedy would be if we forget why. I cannot stop thinking about Ojwang. I watched the video 3 times, and each time I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't just the story of a murdered blogger. It was the story of every African who ever dared to speak and was silenced. His final words echo in my head. I'm afraid of living in a country where truth is a crime. I've shared this video with my younger brother because he needs to know that silence is not safety. Silence is surrender. When Traoré spoke, I cried, not just because of what he said, but because of the way he said it, with no script, no teleprompter, only sincerity. We're so used to leaders who hide behind policy and platitudes. Traoré reminded us what moral courage looks like. He spoke for a boy he never met in a country not his own, and somehow made millions of us feel seen. That's what leadership should be. I live in Addis Ababa, and even here, far from Nairobi, I saw the ripple. Students at my university gathered in the courtyard to listen to the speech. There was no protest sign, no microphone, just a phone playing Traoré's voice. We stood there in silence, and I realized that this isn't just about Kenya. It's about all of us. Every time a journalist disappears, every time a mother cries alone, it becomes our collective shame. Some people say, why should we care? It's not our country. But I say, if we don't care now, who will care when it's our turn? Ojwang may have died in Nairobi, but repression knows no borders. If Kenya silences a blogger today, who will stop Sudan, Nigeria, or Ethiopia from doing the same tomorrow? We must see these moments not as isolated tragedies, but as warnings and act accordingly. I was especially moved by the students who kept printing Ojwang's flyers despite the danger. That's the kind of bravery I'm not sure I have. They risked arrest, maybe worse, just to keep his face visible. In a world full of distractions, keeping memory alive is an act of rebellion. They didn't need a megaphone, they became one. To the mother who asked the police officer, "Do you know why my son died? I just want to say I heard you. I'm a mother too. And even though I'm thousands of miles away in Ghana, I grieved with you. Your pain crossed borders. Your grief became mine. You should never have had to bury your son for telling the truth. I hope President Ruto hears this chorus of grief and rage. I doubt he will, but I hope so." His dismissive comment, "I don't comment on individuals disrupting national order," was colder than a bullet. It confirmed everything we feared, that the system doesn't just ignore the truth, it punishes it. But for every politician who smirks, there are thousands of us who now raise our voices louder. What strikes me is the simplicity of Ojwang's defiance. He didn't call for revolution, he didn't insult anyone, he just asked questions. Honest, uncomfortable, necessary questions. And for that, they killed him. I'm a journalist in Uganda, and I feel that danger every day. I write with one eye over my shoulder. But after this video, I feel less alone, less afraid. The moment when the elderly Kenyan woman stood in the street holding Ojwang's photo and said, "You can kill a man, but not the truth that broke me." It reminded me of my grandmother who raised me during apartheid. She used to say, "Truth walks slowly, but never falls." I think Ojwang is that truth now, walking across a continent. Some viewers say Traoré is a populist, that he's taking advantage of the moment. But I disagree. He didn't need to say anything. No one would have blamed him if he stayed silent. But he didn't. He stood up. And the fact that young Africans are chanting his name from Eldoret to Johannesburg proves something deeper. We're starving for leaders who feel, who speak plainly, who take risks. The line that keeps me up at night is, politics is no longer confined to parliaments. It has spilled into kitchens, chat groups, and timelines. That is so true. I talked to my cousin in Senegal last night. He's never voted in his life, but now he's asking questions about local corruption. That's Ojwang's legacy. He may be gone, but he's awakening people. There's a metal shop in Mombasa where someone painted "Ojwang lit the fire." Traoré carries the torch, and us, we must keep walking. I took a screenshot of that line and made it my wallpaper. It reminds me that this moment is not a spectacle, it's a responsibility. We can't just watch and feel sad. We have to move, we have to speak. It angers me that the Kenyan government banned the Traoré video. That shows how afraid they are, not of violence, but of awareness. That's how fragile power has become. When truth itself is a threat, the regime is already cracking. And what cracks today may collapse tomorrow. As an artist, I've started drawing posters of Ojwang's face for local youth centers here in Lusaka. It's not much, but if one kid walks by and asks, "Who was he?" then I've done something. Stories like this should not just live online. They should live in our streets, in our music, in our classrooms. My daughter asked me why I was crying while watching the video. I told her because someone died for telling the truth, and someone else risked everything to speak up for him. I want her to grow up in an Africa where that sentence no longer makes sense, where telling the truth isn't brave, it's normal. There's a quote from the story that keeps echoing. When a journalist dies and his words are repeated by millions, it's no longer a death, it's a birth. I believe that. Ojwang's death is a seed. Traoré watered it. Now we ordinary people must tend to it. Speak, act, vote, create, defend. I'm not Kenyan, I'm from Algeria. But this story hit me like it was written in my own street. It showed me that Pan-Africanism is not just about trade deals or summit declarations. It's about solidarity when it matters most. Traoré reminded us that Africa's heart still beats, even when its institutions fail. This wasn't just a political video, it was a call to conscience, a challenge to every viewer. And I accept that challenge. I will no longer scroll past stories like this. I will talk about them, teach them, carry them forward. Because if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? Watching this video reminded me that the real battlefield is not just on the streets, it's in our minds, in our courage, and in the conversations we are willing to start. For too long, we've been trained to stay quiet, to survive, rather than live. But Ojwang didn't choose survival, he chose dignity. And Traoré chose solidarity. That combination is dangerous to any system that feeds on silence. I hope this video reaches every school in Africa. Let our youth see what integrity looks like and what it costs. I shared this story with my church group, and we held a prayer in Ojwang's name. Not because he was a saint, but because he was brave. Sometimes bravery is holy, and when someone speaks truth in the face of violence, that's a kind of spiritual leadership the world rarely sees. The pastor said something that struck me. Martyrs are not just those who die for religion, they are also those who die for truth. Ojwang is both a warning and a blessing. As someone working in African media, I felt deeply implicated. Why did it take a Burkina soldier to say what we should have been shouting from the rooftops? The Kenyan press failed Ojwang, but so did the rest of us. We've grown too used to compromise, too numb to outrage. This video shook me awake. It made me realize that neutrality in the face of injustice is betrayal. From now on, I will report with fire. When my grandmother died last year, I thought I had cried all my tears. But today, watching Traoré speak, I cried again, not out of grief, but out of recognition. That someone somewhere still believes that Africa is worth defending, even with his voice alone. Traoré didn't just speak for Ojwang, he spoke for a continent. And that gives me hope that we are not as lost as we sometimes feel. I used to think that revolutions were impossible in today's world, that governments were too strong, that fear was too deep. But watching young people chant Ojwang's name, seeing students risk arrest for printing flyers, reading posts from across Africa, I now believe something has shifted. Not a full revolution, not yet, but a moral uprising, a refusal to forget. And that is how real change begins. The classroom quote Ojwang was one man, but Ojwang is also all of us will stay with me forever. Because it's true, we are all part of this story. Whether we speak or stay silent, we are choosing sides. And today I choose Ojwang's side. I choose the side of courage, of truth, of Africa that will not kneel anymore. The video ends, but the conversation must not. Let us not wait for the next tragedy to be moved. Let us carry this fire into everything we do, from how we vote to what we teach our children to what we post online. Ojwang's voice has become our own, and it must never be silenced again. Who killed Ojwang? A bullet, or the fear of a power structure that's rotting from within? In the ashes of Nairobi, as the blood-red sun sank over the Mathare slums, a Kenyan mother collapsed in the street, cradling the lifeless body of her 19-year-old son, the boy who had just shouted Ojwang deserves justice before a bullet tore through his chest. No ambulance, no justice, just a police loudspeaker repeating disperse or be shot. Do you know what's worse than death? Silence after death. President Ruto, seated comfortably in Parliament, pushed forward a suffocating national budget. No apology, no investigation, while police trampled on Ojwang's photos and tore apart protest signs that read, "We don't eat the budget, we eat to live." As Kenya fell into silence, a voice rose, not from Europe, not from America, but from Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the cameras, his hand over his chest. Ojwang didn't die because he wrote the truth. He was killed by the fear of those in power. If you still believe Africa must save itself, share this video. Because this is not just Kenya's tragedy. It's a wake-up call for an entire continent. Do you know why my son died? The Kenyan mother asked the officer lifting her son's body. Her voice was no longer trembling, it was cold like steel. The officer looked down, said nothing. No one said anything. Because everyone knew Ojwang's death wasn't an accident. It was a message. Kenya is not living in peace. It's surviving under the silent grip of fear. President Ruto doesn't kill with guns, he kills with policies, with budgets, by stripping away every survival option from the poorest of the poor. This year's budget, pushed by Ruto, raised taxes on food, healthcare, and education, with not a single coin allocated to investigating the murders of journalists or bloggers. One lawmaker who objected had his microphone cut off mid-speech. Outside students holding banners reading, "We have the right to the truth," were beaten by police. Everyone knew Ojwang was being watched for weeks before he was shot. He had written a budget analysis showing 12% of national spending had vanished. He warned, if people are not allowed to ask questions, then we're living in a prison. 3 days later, he was dead. He warned us, said a Nairobi student. Ojwang said they won't spare anyone who exposes the truth, and he was right. At a small print shop in East Nairobi, flyers were being printed with Ojwang's face, and the words, "They killed him to kill our voice." Every time someone distributed them, police raided, arrested. But when night fell, hundreds of hands passed the papers quietly, like the last will of a man who died for conscience. In a university dorm, students sat with bloodshot eyes filled with rage. He was one of us. They think they can put out fire with blood. They just sparked a storm. On social media, Ojwang's final 27-second video spread like wildfire. "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of living in a country where truth is a crime." To millions of Kenyans, it was no longer a farewell. It was an indictment. Then came the press conference. President Ruto appeared before the camera's eyes like ice. A foreign journalist asked, "Do you have a message for Ojwang's family?" He smirked. "I don't comment on individuals disrupting national order." The room went silent. Then the sound of camera shutters cracked like gunfire. Outside, fear began to shatter. A 70-year-old woman stood at an intersection, holding a photo of Ojwang high. "You can kill a man, but not the truth, and truth will kill your silence." No one clapped. But phones were raised, videos recorded, and people for the first time began speaking their fears aloud. Ojwang is gone, but the fire he lit cannot be put out. Because it wasn't just the fire of a blogger. It was the last flame keeping a nation from suffocating. They never expected the loudest response to come, not from the West, not from the United Nations, but from a young man in desert fatigues, standing beneath the harsh light of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He stepped up to the podium, eyes steady, no script in hand. Before dozens of international reporters, he spoke, not like a politician reading a statement, but like a man speaking from his conscience. "I cannot stay silent when a man is murdered in broad daylight for telling the truth. Not because he was Kenyan, but because he was African." The room fell silent. Traoré didn't speak in diplomatic jargon. He spoke in the kind of language the people of Mathare could understand, feel, and cry over. Ojwang didn't die. He was killed by fear, the fear of those who forgot that power is not to rule, but to serve. His words didn't just hit headlines, they set social media on fire. Every phrase became a rallying cry. Justice for Ojwang. Traore speaks truth. Africa won't be silent. In Kisumu, a young orphan clutched an old phone, tears in his eyes watching the video. He heard us. Our own leaders never did. In Eldoret, hundreds of students chanted Traoré's name like he was the only one standing between them and tyranny. A female student said, "No leader has ever spoken like that, as if he lost his own brother." Nobody gave Traoré a title, but the people called him the first to do politics with a heart. Meanwhile, in Nairobi, Ruto's government was rattled. Traoré's tweets were shared by young African leaders across the continent. A wave of demand for justice and transparency spread faster than a virus. A Ghanaian MP wrote, "We need more Traorés and fewer Rutos." Ruto's response, an emergency press conference. He sat beside his spokesperson, hastily reading a statement. "Kenya is a sovereign nation. We don't need democracy lectures from Burkina Faso." But those words couldn't stop the tide. On the ground, young journalists quietly returned to their work. A local radio station played Traoré's speech on repeat, no commentary, no edits, just his voice echoing again and again. People gathered around phone shops, listening, crying, then applauding. One man whispered, "For the first time, I don't feel alone." Then, like dominoes falling, African nations began to speak out. Nigeria called for an independent investigation. Senegal held a vigil for Ojwang. Uganda canceled a security agreement with Kenya in protest of the violence against journalists. Kenyan media, once silent, began to publish headlines. What did Ojwang really say? And why was Traoré the first to speak? And in the hearts of the people, hope fragile but fierce returned. Not because Traoré was a savior, but because he reminded them they are not forgotten. In a metal shop in Mombasa, a welder painted on the wall, Ojwang lit the fire. Traoré carries the torch, and us we must keep walking. As night falls over Nairobi, it's not streetlights that glow, but thousands of phone screens replaying Ojwang's image. There he stands, gentle smile, defiant eyes, saying, "I'm not afraid to die. I'm afraid of truth being strangled." Now his words echo not just in Mathaire's alleys, but in Bamako, Addis Ababa, Johannesburg. A once unknown blogger has become a symbol, not because he lived long, but because he died at a moment that forced Africa to open its eyes. Silence has been broken, and like waves after an earthquake, other voices are rising. A young journalist in Uganda writes, "Ojwang is the truth that was killed. Traoré is the rage of truth that survived." A Ghanaian scholar says on live TV, the question is no longer, who will speak up? It's, do we have the courage not to stay silent? A mother in Congo records a message for her son in France. "I never understood politics, but I know this pain is real." Politics is no longer confined to parliaments. It has spilled into kitchens, chat groups, and timelines. And the Kenyan government. They ban the Traoré video. They hold closed-door hearings on information security. They label dissent as an insult to the nation. But it's too late. When a people no longer fear power loses its armor. When a journalist dies and his words are repeated by millions, it's no longer a death. It's a birth. The birth of a generation that won't swallow lies. The birth of an Africa that refuses to kneel. In a classroom in Burkina Faso, an 8th grader writes on the board, "Ojwang was one man, but Ojwang is also all of us." At prayer gatherings, clergy offer blessings for those who died for justice. In street rap anthems, the names Ojwang and Traoré rise as emblems of defiance. A Kenyan man says on radio, "We were wrong to think a lone blogger would be forgotten. On the contrary, he was the drop that overflowed the cup." And in the hearts of millions, the question is no longer, who will speak for us, but when will we be brave enough to turn pain into action? Call to action. If you've heard this story, if something stirred in your heart, don't let it fade like wind. Share this video. Send it to a friend, to a mother, a son, a coworker. Comment, what do you think happens when millions rise in unison? Keep the fire alive. By refusing to let the truth be twisted. By standing with those who dare to speak. Ojwang doesn't need a statue. He needs a collective conscience that never sleeps. A new question. We once believed revolutions came through guns. But maybe the real revolution comes from old phones, from the voices of the ordinary, from the question why asked so many times it can't be ignored. Maybe Kenya is just the spark. Maybe Ojwang's death is the kindling for an Africa that no longer compromises with silence. And if that's true, then history will not be written by the victor's pens, but by the tears of the awakened. Some stories are not meant to be read with the eyes, but with the heart. The story of Ojwang of Kenya and of Traoré is not just a political account. It is a moral fracture, a raw cry from the soul of a continent that has long lived under the weight of fear and silence. Ojwang, a young blogger, had no army, no fortune, no political seat. He had only words. But words in a time of darkness are more dangerous than bullets. He dared to question, to expose, to demand transparency, and for that he paid the ultimate price. His death was not just a tragedy, it was a mirror held up to all of us. What does it mean when telling the truth becomes a death sentence? Kenya's tragedy is not unique. From Nigeria to Sudan, from Congo to Ethiopia, we have seen what happens when voices are crushed, when fear becomes the national anthem and silence the unofficial law. But something changed this time. Not because Ojwang was more famous, but because this time someone answered. Traoré, a captain, a leader, but above all, a human being, chose not to remain silent. His voice, echoing from Burkina Faso, cut through the noise of global indifference. He did what many leaders fear: he spoke the truth without permission. This moment, this exchange of courage between a fallen blogger and a rising voice, represents something greater than two men. It is a collision of pain and hope, a reminder that power does not only reside in palaces and parliaments, it also lives in words, in truth, in defiance. What makes this story unforgettable is not just its emotion, it is its clarity, the cruelty of power, the courage of youth, the resilience of the oppressed. It is a blueprint of a new African consciousness, one that refuses to be dictated to, one that will not trade dignity for peace. Ojwang's death shook a nation, but Traoré's words shook a continent. And in the silence that followed, both millions found their voices. There is something sacred about a voice that speaks when it is most dangerous to do so. It reminds us that democracy is not given, it is fought for. And sometimes the loudest cries for justice come not from the powerful, but from those who have nothing left to lose. The reactions from across Africa: students chanting mothers, mourning rappers rhyming his name, children writing his quote on blackboards, show that this is not a passing wave. It is a rising tide. This is no longer about Kenya alone. It's about who we want to be as a continent. Do we want a future where truth is buried and lies are rewarded? Or do we want a future where speaking out is not suicidal, but sacred? We are at a crossroads. The leaders we choose and the silence we tolerate will shape the Africa of tomorrow. Traoré's courage shows what's possible. Ojwang's sacrifice reminds us of the cost. Now it is our turn to answer. Because if we let this story fade, if we scroll past it like another piece of tragic news, then we become complicit in the very silence that killed Ojwang. But if we carry his story in our conversations, in our classrooms, in our art, in our elections, then maybe, just maybe, we'll be worthy of the future he dreamed of. Ojwang did not die for nothing. He died so that one day a child in Nairobi could speak the truth without fear. He died so that leaders like Traoré would not feel alone in speaking up. He died to remind us that freedom is not a slogan, it is a daily choice. And the question now is not whether we heard his voice, it's whether we're ready to speak ours. Quote on blackboards show that this is not a passing wave, it is a rising tide. This is no longer about Kenya alone, it's about who we want to be as a continent. Do we want a future where truth is buried and lies are rewarded? Or do we want a future where speaking out is not suicidal, but sacred? We are at a crossroads. The leaders we choose and the silence we tolerate will shape the Africa of tomorrow. Traoré's courage shows what's possible. Ojwang's sacrifice reminds us of the cost. Now it is our turn to answer. Because if we let this story fade, if we scroll past it like another piece of tragic news, then we become complicit in the very silence that killed Ojwang. But if we carry his story in our conversations, in our classrooms, in our art, in our elections, then maybe, just maybe, we'll be worthy of the future he dreamed of. Ojwang did not die for nothing. He died so that one day a child in Nairobi could speak the truth without fear. He died so that leaders like Traoré would not feel alone in speaking up. He died to remind us that freedom is not a slogan, it is a daily choice. And the question now is not whether we heard his voice, it's whether we're ready to speak ours. Quote on blackboards show that this is not a passing wave, it is a rising tide. This is no longer about Kenya alone, it's about who we want to be as a continent. Do we want a future where truth is buried and lies are rewarded? Or do we want a future where speaking out is not suicidal, but sacred? We are at a crossroads. The leaders we choose and the silence we tolerate will shape the Africa of tomorrow. Traoré's courage shows what's possible. Ojwang's sacrifice reminds us of the cost. Now it is our turn to answer. Because if we let this story fade, if we scroll past it like another piece of tragic news, then we become complicit in the very silence that killed Ojwang. But if we carry his story in our conversations, in our classrooms, in our art, in our elections, then maybe, just maybe, we'll be worthy of the future he dreamed of. Ojwang did not die for nothing. He died so that one day a child in Nairobi could speak the truth without fear. He died so that leaders like Traoré would not feel alone in speaking up. He died to remind us that freedom is not a slogan, it is a daily choice. And the question now is not whether we heard his voice, it's whether we're ready to speak ours.